Jojo the dog-faced boy, the Ohio Bigfoot girl, and the mule-faced woman are just some of the people we'll meet today. Step right up, folks. It's Genodermatoses in the American Sideshow. And this is Derek Adams from Red Bluff, California, and I don't have any conflicts of interest.
Hurry, hurry, step this way, the strangest sights on the island. Bricks from the four corners of the world. Want two nickels, one dime, a tenth part of a dollar. We've got the show if you've got the dime. It's just starting, so hurry, hurry. Look 'em over, the lady without a head. There are thin ones, there are fat ones. They're all inside.
Ready? Today I'm going to present some people that did not win the genetic ectodermal lottery. Many of these people were born into very intolerant times, and despite their circumstances and despite their surroundings, some of them absolutely crushed it. Others did not, and they led lives of suffering and exploitation. But please know I present each of these individuals with utmost respect. We're going to look at some of the genodermatoses and meet some of the people afflicted with them and talk about how they made their way in the world, which was often as so-called freaks or sideshow performers. There'll also be a few side tangents, but we're largely going to stick to the theme of genoderms that were on display in and around early 1900. Most of the people today will be American, but there are several prominent ones from other countries that are just too unique to omit. And it's really sobering to ponder that all of us have two or three people in our practices that in past years would have been forced to join some of these freak shows and make their living on the road being displayed. This is P.T. Barnum, and everybody knows who he is, especially since the musical The Greatest Showman debuted a few years ago. But Hugh Jackman's portrayal of this marketing wizard was largely a fantastical idealization, if not an outright lie or euphemism for the real man. And this isn't a talk about P.T. Barnum per se, but he was the colossus behind the sideshow business, and it's worth noting that he got his start. In fact, his very first exhibit, as he called it, was displaying an African-American slave woman to his audiences. And get this, the hook was that this woman, Joyce Heath, was not only just 161 years old, but she was actually the wet nurse for George Washington himself, and the audience loved it. Though slavery was outlawed in Pennsylvania and New York at the time, there was this loophole that allowed him to lease her for $1,000. And whether or not P.T. Barnum considered himself a slaveholder or not is unknown, because he conveniently kind of glosses over all of this in his autobiography. So I realize just an old woman with wrinkles is not a genodermatosis per se, but it is a semi-related derm story, and it's too good of a story not to share, actually. When Miss Heath died in 1836, Barnum had one more trick up his sleeve, and he hosted a live autopsy in this saloon in New York, and about 1,500 people paid 50 cents a piece to see the dead woman pretty much cut up, and it revealed she was only about half her reported age. Our first group of people we're going to look at suffer from congenital hypertrichosis, which is, as we know, a skin disease that has excessive lanugo hair, often covering the entire body at birth, with exception of the palms, the soles, and the mucous membranes. And the hair can evidently be 3 to 5 centimeters in length, and the condition follows an autosomal dominant pattern of inheritance. This is an extraordinarily rare condition, but if you remember from the mummy talk, there's actually an Egyptian mummy who had this as well too, so this is probably an ancient genoderm. So let's meet Annie Jones, who toured with P.T. Barnum and became the country's top bearded lady and acted as a spokesman for Barnum's Congress of Freaks. Annie was born in Virginia, and her family called her baby Esau, based off the story of Jacob and Esau, who were the twin sons of Rebekah and Isaac in the Old Testament. The story is one of struggle about starting birth with, the deck stacked against you, and Esau, as we are told, was the firstborn and was covered with red hair, quote, like a hairy mantle. And some of the translations I found said it was like a garment or a fur coat, and others just translated it as having hair all over his body. Barnum started to exhibit her when she was only 9 months old, because her mother leased her to the circus for $150 a week, and she was billed as the infant Esau. Somehow she was kidnapped along the way by this crazy phrenologist and was missing for 6 months. And when P.T. and the mother searched in vain for her, they finally found the kidnapper, or found out the kidnapper was going to exhibit her in this church fair in some other county, and charges were filed, but the judge couldn't decide who had ownership of little Annie. But when little Annie saw her mother, she immediately ran into her arms, and the judge decided that was indeed her child. There were various attempts to kidnap her over the years. And at the time, Annie had a long, real, silky beard that people often remarked at how Christ-like she appeared. And when she was barely 16 years old, she married one of the carnival barkers, but then divorced right afterwards. And then she married P.T. Barnum's wardrobe manager. Annie promoted herself throughout Europe by herself, separate from P.T. Barnum, and went to St. Petersburg, and she met the Tsar Romanovs and their family. And in Italy, she made a handsome living posing for artists who needed a human model for Christ in their pictures, but didn't want the masculine jaggedness of a man's face and wanted a soft touch. So Annie made enough money, she was able to invest very shrewdly in Brooklyn real estate. And at one point, she was making about $500 a week, which the online calculators say that's about $15,000 a week today. And keep in mind, that's before income taxes were levied. Our next performer is Theodore Petrov, or Jojo the Dog-Faced Boy. Now, it's said that he was the inspiration for Chewbacca on Star Wars. I don't know if this is true, and George Lucas wouldn't return my phone calls for some reason. But in the 1870s, Europe got acquainted with this wolf man who was a 55-year-old Russian man named Adrian Shevchikov. I think I'm saying that right. And he was accompanied by his little illegitimate son, who was also hairy and had hypertrichosis as well. And they were billed as being the product of an affair between a bear and a Russian peasant woman. And the father became somewhat of a forced hermit. He developed a taste for alcohol and was a cruel drunk, really, by all accounts. And he had this unkept and kind of debauched appearance. And his son, Theodore, was, stark contrast. He would wear these really nice outfits and charm the audiences, it said, with his, quote, impish attitude and inquisitive nature. And he also enjoyed speaking to audiences in their native tongue. Well, then this father and son pair, just disappeared. And 10 years later, Theodore Petrov appeared and began a long career with P.T. Barnum. And European audiences were told that hunters found young Theodore in the wild, they captured him, and they taught him to be civilized, and they set him on tour for the world. And actually, it was just this old guy with hypertrichosis who was a drunk. It was just his son. And his father had returned with all of his money from his European tour back in the 1870s and just promptly drank himself to death with his earnings. Barnum billed Theodore as the most prodigious paragon of all prodigies he had secured in over 50 years. And it was said at his first public unveiling, he was met with audible gasps from the assembled media, and his animalistic looks contrasted with the neatly pressed and ornate Russian cavalry uniform he wore. Barnum fielded questions, and after members of the press were affirmed that Jojo did not bite, they lined up and took turns tugging on his facial hair. At times, Jojo would live up to his namesake, and he would growl and kind of snap at members of the audience, but he was missing his two front teeth, probably from his hypertrichosis. But he was known as a quiet and dignified man, very gentle and generous. He was said to have spoken 5 languages. And unfortunately, following a bout of pneumonia that he contracted on tour in Greece in 1904, he passed away. Now we're going to meet the Minnesota woolly girl, Alice Elizabeth Dougherty, who supposedly holds the unique distinction as being the only recorded American to be born with hypertrichosis linguinosa. Alice was born in 1887 in Minneapolis, and there was no family history, and none of her siblings were affected with hypertrichosis. But her father figured out at a very young age that the public would gladly pay to marvel at the little child, and she began being exhibited at the age of 2 on a local level. But then demand quickly dictated larger tours into the Midwest. Alice was a bright-eyed and playful child, it was said, and she was curious in spirit as well as to behold. And one admirer from Wisconsin recorded that the toddler was, quote, as frolicsome as a kitten, while another one in Michigan declared that she's the most miraculous baby ever born. And by age 5, the hair on her face measured more than 5 inches, and by her early teens, it was closer to 9 inches in length. She retired from show business in 1915 and passed away of unknown causes in Dallas in 1933. Okay, let's leave hypertrichosis behind and we'll move on to Milroy's disease, which is primary or hereditary lymphedema type 1A with very early onset lymphedema. It's an autosomal dominant condition. It's on chromosome number 5, and it is caused by mutation in the FLT4 gene, which encodes the vascular endothelial growth factor. There's only been about 200 cases of this reported. This is Miss Fannie Mills, also known as the Ohio Bigfoot Girl. She was actually born in England, but her family migrated to Ohio in 1860, and it's unknown when her ailment first started or was first noticed. But it was believed to be caused by prenatal maternal stress, kind of like a maternal impression, which these ideas were very common back then. And during pregnancy, it was said that Fanny's mother had to care for a foal that had an injured limb and was swollen, and the suffering of the animal was probably imprinted upon Fanny. Fanny was a fairly petite woman. She only weighed 115 pounds. Her feet were 19 inches long and 7 inches wide, though. She wore a size 30 shoe that was made of 3 goat skins. And one of her paying gigs was that you could pay her to stamp out your cigarette butt for you. She started to tour the country in 1885 as that girl from Ohio, and her promoters advertised her to unwed men as a boon for poor bachelors, and they offered $5,000 and a well-stocked farm for any man who would actually marry her. And the ad says, "Don't permit 2 big feet to stand between you and wedlock tinged with fortune." And she actually ended up marrying her nurse's brother in 1886, and she retired from show business in 1891. Moving on now, we're going to talk about the Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which, as you know, are a group of related disorders all caused by different genetic defects in collagen. This is Felix Warhe, and he was able to stretch his skin to such great lengths they took on the name Elastic Man. But Elastic Men or Rubber Men were real common staples for sideshows back around the turn of the century. And this is James Morris, who was born in Copenhagen, New York in 1859, and he can make his own COVID mask, evidently. He was able to stretch his skin up to 18 inches from his body with no perceptible pain, and this made him incredibly popular with the officers when he joined the military. And those officers started to invite their buddies and the reporters and the journalists to come witness Morris, and that landed Morris apart with P.T. Barnum, and he traveled the world with him in 1885. And this is Niccolò Paganini, who either had Marfan's or EDS. It's, historians love to speculate on diseases that famous people had, but Niccolò has been called the violin virtuoso. That's a tongue twister. The violin virtuoso's violin virtuoso. And he was one of the first superstars of music. He was so limber he could stretch his thumbs across the back of his hands, and he could also supposedly wiggle his middle finger joints laterally like a bunch of little metronomes. And Paganini was capable of playing 3 octaves across 4 strings, which I'm told is a nearly impossible feat by my friends who play violin. He could also use his bow with his right hand, and he could pick the strings with his left, making this unholy sound like 2 violins were playing at once. There was a rumor that he had sold his soul to the devil for these unnatural gifts, and I like to think of him as the original Marilyn Manson or Ozzy Osbourne, because he embraced these rumors and held concerts in cemeteries at twilight, and he titled his pieces things like Devil's Laughter and Witch's Dance. And he wore a black long frock coat, and it was said that his white face would just hover, kind of like a specter above him. So because of these devilish rumors, the church denied him a Catholic burial in Genoa. So his family pretty much schlepped his corpse around for months on end. And they even left it in a leper colony at one point until they found out the caretaker was running a side hustle by letting gawkers pay him to see it. So they moved him to a cement tub in an olive oil processing plant. And finally, after 36 years, the church allowed him to be buried. Now we're going to move into kind of a motley assortment of things that I've just titled hypertrophic disorders for convenience. This is Joseph Merrick, aka the Elephant Man. And if you're curious as to what he is suffering from, well, so is everybody else. The exact cause of his deformities is unclear. It was conjectured that he had Proteus syndrome, possibly some strange neurofibromatosis, which I think has fallen more out of favor. And they did some DNA tests on his hair and on his bones in 2003, but they were largely inconclusive. Joseph was born without any abnormalities and didn't reportedly develop them until his early teenage years. And his mother was noted to have some kind of unspecified physical disability, so maybe it was hereditary, but she passed away when Joseph was only 11. All of his siblings were notably normal, however. But when his mother died, his stepmother didn't want him at home, so they pretty much kicked Merrick out of the house, and he became a hawker of goods. He ended up in a workhouse, and it was so awful, he felt the only way he could make money was to join the circus. So he joined Tom Norman's circus in London and, of course, was a superstar in his freak show. There's been a lot of debate about whether Norman was using Merrick and abusing him. Merrick made a lot of money starring in the shows, but Norman always made more. Whatever the truth was, though, Joseph Merrick never really experienced freedom. He arrived in London at age 22, and was contained and kept in freak shows before heading off to Belgium, where largely the same thing happened to him there. And then he came back to London, and he was completely destitute, and he was taken into a hospital for the poor at age 24, and he passed away at age 27. During his hot time in the hospital, though, in his latter days, he was visited by a lot of famous people, including Princess Alexandra. And it was largely because at this time, public opinion had turned against freak shows, and freak shows were shut down, and royal societies were founded in order to restore medicine's professional image, probably when our Grand Rounds started. The fascination with Mr. Merrick transcends the decades, as his life has inspired no fewer than 2 full-length movies and several plays, probably the most famous of which was in 1980. There was a film that was directed by David Lynch, and it starred John Hurt as the Elephant Man, which is pictured here, as well as Anthony Hopkins. And it was also produced by Mel Brooks. However, they did leave his name intentionally off the credits to avoid confusion with audiences who possibly thought they were coming to see a comedy. And on the left there is Bradley Cooper, who portrayed the Elephant Man in an off-Broadway play. And then there's Charlie Heaton, better known as the kid from Stranger Things, who is going to star as Joseph Merrick in an Elephant Man movie that should come out in the next few years. And now we'll meet Arthur Loss, also known as a rubber-faced man or the rubber-necked man or the bulldog man. And he was born with massive skin folds hanging from his face, as you can see. And of course, you guys know that's a plexiform neurofibroma. And he was featured in Ripley's Believe It or Not. It's called the Auditorium, as in the Auditorium, in Chicago in 1933. And this is an older photo I came across. Really, there's not any historical context with it. I don't know the person's name or their history. It looks like a Maffucci syndrome. Those are possibly endochondromas. If any of you guys have any ideas on what this could be or know who this individual is, I've left my email at the end of this, and I'd appreciate you letting me know. But for now, I think we're just going to call it Maffucci's. Our next case is a very unfortunate woman who suffered from Sturge-Weber syndrome. One of the things that makes these cases so interesting is we don't see these extreme presentations of cases like this too often anymore. 1888, Numa, Iowa. A perfectly normal baby girl, Grace McDaniels, came into the world. Soon afterwards, she started to develop facial hypertrophy of the tissues, and she was known as the mule-faced woman later in life. She didn't have any siblings that were afflicted with this, and as we know, that's because this is due to a mosaic somatic activating mutation in the GNAQ gene, and radiologic findings will show tram tract calcifications on a CT, so I snuck in a little board review for your residents there. From what I can find out, Grace must have been just a delightful woman. She really embraced her disability. On a side note, she never liked having a picture taken because she felt that advertising herself would show a lack of self-respect. And it's kind of funny how we've done a 180 from that in society now, especially. Remember, doctors didn't used to advertise themselves when I was growing up, and now everyone's plastered all over social media 5 minutes of every day. She's proof that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and a warm personality does win people over. Thank God for most of us, right? She received a large number of marriage proposals before accepting one and gave birth to a healthy baby boy. She's quoted as saying, "My remarkable facial condition is a birthmark due to a confusion in the capillary, arterial, and nervous systems previous to my birth. I lead a normal life, prefer housekeeping, although the show life is an enjoyable and healthful one."
With laughter, song, and fun. Coney Island, a mecca by day, a glittering spectacle by night.
Most of the sideshows at the time would always feature a fat lady who these days wouldn't really raise too many eyebrows, let alone people paying to see them. But Celesta Geyer, aka Dolly Dimples, was probably one of the more entertaining ones that I could find. She was born in Cincinnati, Ohio, to a close-knit German-American family where it said that overeating was normal. 6 times a day, the family would sit down to large meals and substantial snacks. And she developed a big appetite, and she preferred playing with candy rather than toys. She weighed almost 400 pounds in her 20s, and she was a very attractive woman by all accounts, and she had many suitors. And she married a gentleman named Frank Geyer, who worked at the Ford Motor Company, but during the Depression, he lost his job, and to help meet the financial needs of the family, Celeste joined the traveling circus at the invitation of another professional fat lady who told her that, hey, people are laughing at you anyway, you might as well make some good money for the privilege of them doing it. Dolly would consume about 10,000 calories a day. She was 4'11" and peaked at 588 pounds, despite what this poster here says. And I'm sitting here drinking my white hot chocolate from Starbucks, and I looked that up, and that's 600 calories, so I think I'm going to be stopping that. But after surviving a near-fatal heart attack in 1950, she went on an 800-calorie per day diet, and she reduced her weight all the way down to 112 pounds and maintained it for the rest of her life. So next time people tell me they can't lose any weight, or I tell myself that, I'm going to have to remember Dolly Dimples. In addition to the fat woman, most shows had a tattooed man, and the Great Omni was one of the most popular ones of all time. He was also called the Zebra Man. He was born Horace Riddler, and he was actually a major in the First World War in the British Army. Just decided his life wasn't interesting enough, so he started doing body modification, filing his teeth down, tattooing these primitive zebra stripes all over him. And just like most people with body modification, they enjoy talking about it and telling people about it, so the carnival was a natural fit for him. His story was that when he was in Papua New Guinea, some natives held him down and tortured him and tattooed him all over his body, which is a fanciful story. But it played to the audience's ignorance and fantasies about native life in foreign lands during the day. And as much as tattooed men were fascinating, people absolutely lost their puritanical Victorian minds, and their ideals of normal were shattered when women were tattooed. Now this is pretty normal, of course. Like the obesity issue, it wouldn't really draw much of a crowd, if any of a crowd, on its own. I love this tattooed girl. Why? And she's alive. And I included these last few slides of tattoos and the heavyset women more on a commentary on how our idea of what is normal has morphed in the last 100 years than really any dermatologic academic purpose. So-called lobster people were also a common staple of sideshows. As you know, they have ectrodactyly ectodermal dysplasia syndrome, sometime with or without cleft palate or oral facial clefts. And we know that EEC is caused by a mutation in the TP63 gene, and it's autosomal dominant, which this case will illustrate here. This is this is Grady Stiles. His ancestor was William Stiles, who apparently was the first in the family to have the condition way back in 1805. Then he had a son named Jacob, then Elijah, and then Grady Stiles Sr., and then Grady Stiles Jr. that we see here. And as you can see on his feet, his condition was quite severe, and he was unable to walk. And he learned to use his hands and his arms for locomotion, and as a result developed this Hulk-like upper body strength. And he was married twice and had 4 children, and 2 of those children actually were born with variations of EEC. But Grady here had quite a dark side. He was known to be a highly abusive drunk, and he would use this Hulk-like strength, his upper body strength, that he had to beat his wives and children. And when his oldest daughter, Donna, fell in love and became engaged in 1978, Grady didn't approve of her choice of suitor, and something went down, and the night before the pair was to be married, Grady picked up a shotgun and murdered the young groom in cold blood. The trial was a media circus, and Grady just openly confessed the crime, didn't show any remorse. However, he didn't serve any time for the murder. He used his condition to his advantage and stated that since the prison system was not equipped to deal with his disability, that it would be cruel and unusual punishment to confine him. So Grady was let off on 15 years probation. Now Grady felt invincible. He promptly resumed beating his wife, and one of his favorite taunts was, "I killed before and I got away with it, I can do it again." Amazingly, during this time, he remarried his first wife, Maria, and she left her husband to come back to Grady and pretty much instantly regretted the choice as the beatings ensued. Finally, the family had enough. In November 29th, 1993, Grady was gunned down by a hired assassin. The hitman was a 19-year-old sideshow performer, Chris Wynant, who was a neighbor to the Stiles family. They paid him $1,500 in cash, and he put 3 bullets into the skull of Grady Stiles Jr., the lobster boy. Pascal Pignon toured the United States as the Two-Headed Mexican. He had some kind of a cylindroma or some kind of a tumor on his head of unknown origin, but he decorated the tumor with this wax face, so he was called the Two-Headed Mexican, and he performed with Sellers Floto Circus in the early 1900s. He was a railroad worker from Texas, and he was discovered by the sideshow promoter, whose attention was caught by that large cyst or tumor on his head, And he drafted him into the freak show, and he made a wax face to place on his tumor and made the claim he had 2 heads. And there were some reports that was made of silver and was surgically placed under the skin. Some of these details are lost. But after several years of touring, the circus manager paid to have it surgically removed and Pinion returned to Texas. Scientists point out now, though, that if it really did have a second head, Pinion's second head would have been upside down because it would be an incomplete craniophagous twin. To illustrate how insensitive times were, or maybe how thin-skinned we've got today, or maybe a little bit of both, we can look at Mary Ann Bevins, who had acromegaly. And following the passing of her husband in 1914, she found herself solely financially responsible for her 4 children. So in an effort to make some money, she entered and then won the World's Ugliest Woman contest. And then after that, she hooked up with Coney Island's Dreamland Circus in 1920 and was displayed as the homeliest woman in the world. Recently, a Hallmark card featured an image of Mary Ann Bevins over in the UK, but there were complaints against it that it was offensive and inappropriate, so Hallmark had to take it off the market. Cutaneous horns are always fun to see in the clinic. They never seem to get old for some reason, and horned humans actually have a rich background in myth. There are the horns of Alexander the Great, the supposed horns of Moses, and many important figures have been purported to possess horns throughout history, and they have different meanings for different cultures and different time periods. This is a famous picture. It was made in 1930 of a Chinese farmer who was discovered by an expat Russian banker when he was in China. And the Russian was able to take a picture of the man, and he sent the snapshot to Robert Ripley of Ripley's Believe It or Not. And the man is only known as Wang, and sometimes he's referred to as Wing. The farmer was normal in every aspect except for the fact that he possessed a 14-inch spire-like horn growing from the back of his head. And Ripley offered a huge cash reward to anybody that could find Wang and get him to appear at the auditorium. But Wang disappeared from the public eye in the early 1930s and was never heard from again. Believe it or not. When my daughter saw this picture, she said, "Oh, that guy's obviously a Capricorn." There have been several famous horns throughout history, too. There was a woman in France who, in 1696, evidently amputated her own horn and presented it to the King of France as a gift. And then there's a collection at the London Museum where there's a human horn that's 11 inches long and 2.5 inches in circumference. And as you can see, we're moving into disorders of pigmentation. This is George and Willie Muse, were black albino, identical twin brothers who had the misfortune of being born in the Jim Crow American South. With their long white dreadlocks, the promoters felt it was best to promote them as the white Ecuadorian cannibals, Echo and Iko. But that gimmick failed to really attract crowds, and then the brothers were rechristened the Sheep-Headed Men, and later, 1923, the Ambassadors from Mars. The men from Mars traveled extensively with Barnes Circus. Unfortunately, they were being fed, housed, and trained in playing the mandolin, but nobody was paying them. They finally got out of their contract after a long legal dispute. In their first season back, they played Madison Square Garden and drew over 10,000 spectators during each of their performances. They went to Europe and met the Queen of England, and in 1937 they returned to Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus for several years and finally ended their career in 1961. George Muse passed away in 1971, and many expected Willie to follow quickly after his brother. But they were wrong. Willie continued to play his mandolin and enjoyed the company of friends and family, it is said, until his death on Good Friday in 2001. The man that was featured behind them in that last side was Candy Shelton, who's their manager, and he was skimming profits off of them for years. So I guess you never trust a man named Candy. During the turn of the century, there was a multitude of escape artists, but none were better than Houdini. But the Ice King, Tom Jack, was almost as unique. Tom Jack was born as Karl Bro in the Czech Republic in 1884. And despite his appearance, or maybe because of it, Karl developed into a very jovial and outgoing young man, evidently. He was known as something of a kind of a class clown, Tom Sawyer-like adventure seeker amongst his peers. So no one was surprised when a traveling circus came to town, and the teenage Karl was among the first townies to purchase a ticket for the tent show, and he left with the circus, actually. And Karl stole the show from the stands by mocking and impersonating the ringmaster. Karl was an adept magician and a daring escape artist. I like to think of him a lot like a David Blaine from the turn of the century, only an albino David Blaine. And oftentimes piebald individuals, like the gentleman there on the right, were displayed alongside people with albinism, and no one really knew the difference back then. And oftentimes piebald people were displayed as zebra people. The first image depicting piebaldism in a human being is this painting on the left, and it's done by an unknown Colombian artist in 1740, and it bears this inscription: "The true picture of Marie Sabina, who was born October 12, 1736, at Matuna plantation belonging to the Jesuits in the city of Cartagena in America, of two Negro slaves named Martanio and Petrona." And it's speculated that the reason that the artist listed the two parents on there is, and gave you this pretty detailed pedigree, was that naturalists of the day thought that this child had to be the result of a white person and someone of African descent having a baby. And to preserve the honor of the Society of the Jesuits, it was written that both parents were slaves. Thinking was later changed to have this little gal be the product of a union between a slave and then an albino slave. In a bizarre through-the-looking-glass revelation by doing this here, and certainly this doesn't fit the narrative in our country, but it seems that in Africa, they're way more intolerant to pigmentary disorders than we are here in America. In large parts of Africa, people with albinism live in constant fear of being killed or maimed, mutilated, and the continent has a deep-rooted superstition that their light-skinned body parts will bring good luck and are even magical. This is Canadian Peter Ash, who'd be a great speaker to have someday for us. He himself suffers from albinism, and he founded this organization to help these persecuted children and offer them protection. It's called Under the Same Sun. I know many of you have gone to Botswana through DO Care and have worked at some of his facilities. In Tanzania, people with albinism are called Zuru, meaning ghosts. And it's assumed that some of these ghosts even bleed a different color or that they're immortal. And these dangerous beliefs cause witch doctors to attack people with albinism and, like I said, mutilate them, grind up their bones for potion. They will sell their hair to fishermen to weave into their nets to provide a good catch. And these victims can be kidnapped or attacked in the middle of the night and have their arms hacked off and dismembered by these hired killers. Sometimes they're even sold by family members, and body parts can fetch up to $75,000. And if we think we have it bad with our election years here in America, the government puts out warnings in Tanzania warning people of albinism to pretty much lay low because the witch doctors are going to be after them to harvest body parts to sell to would-be politicians who want to collect the vote. Tanzania has the highest number of attacks. And in Tanzania, 1 in 1,400 people have albinism, where in most other parts of Africa it occurs in about 1 of every 5,000 to 15,000 people. And Under the Same Sun is trying to raise awareness of this and provide protection for these individuals. I found this online. That's posted by someone with albinism. Says, "We are not carriers of coronavirus. Stop tagging us."
Marvelous freaks you'll see for the price of a small thin dime. You get the whole show now if you hurry, hurry, hurry.
I love that guy. Hurry, hurry, hurry. So now the ichthyotic disorders. Although, of course, as we know, it means fish. The sideshows would focus it on being alligator-themed or maybe elephant-themed skin. So that was their angle there. Susie the Elephant Girl was born in 1909 in Berlin. And she had ichthyosis evidently right out of the womb or shortly after birth, where her skin turned gray and cracked, and her parents said it had elephantine properties. You can imagine the physical pain she was in and the secondary infections that she had to deal with throughout her life. She couldn't even blink her eyes, it says, without risk of life-threatening cracks. And in addition to the physical pain, she had to endure the emotional pain as well, and the ridicule and the segregation of her peers. During the hot summer days when other kids would frolic in the water, it was said that Susie would have to rub ice on her arms in an effort to cool her skin that left her unable to sweat. And other children pointed and laughed at her, and she could not shed a single tear because her condition had robbed her of her lacrimal functions as well. You have to hand it to Susie's parents. They were some A+ eczema parents. They gave her put generous amounts of oil and moisturizer on her daily. But they also took, because they were concerned about her appearance, they took to peeling the skin off of her face on a nightly basis, and evidently did wonders for her skin, and it revealed a quite attractive face beneath all the scale. However, as you guys know, Susie would have to have done this daily for the rest of her life. The alligator skin girl was Esher Parnell. She was born in 1926 in Kinley, North Carolina. She was one of 6 siblings, and 2 of her brothers were born with ichthyosis as well, and one of them toured with her, actually. And they had very sparse hair from their ichthyosis, and they didn't have any eyelashes as well. And the hairless features and their scaling contributed to this unusual appearance of the sibling, and thus they got the two alligator-skinned marvels began their career. William, the younger brother, was commonly known as Aloha the alligator boy, and Escher was known as Alice. And together they were billed as the alligator-skinned twins, but they weren't really twins at all. A lot of their promotional material harkened back to the P.T. Barnum-like days I mentioned earlier about maternal impressions. According to one of the pamphlets that were used to promote the alligator twins, their appearance was due to their mother having been frightened by an alligator while pregnant with the twins. And speaking of maternal impressions and how popular they were in the day, we have Ralph Kruner, who had some sort of palmoplantar keratoderma, and he was born in Montpelier, Vermont in 1888. And the story with him was his mother, when she was pregnant, was traumatized by a stampeding group of elephants, and the rampaging circus elephants allegedly killed 5 men and injured 21. Ralph's mother purportedly witnessed the carnage and was so affected by the episode that 4 months later her son was born into the world with elephantine hide rather than supple skin. And of course, this story is obviously lunacy. And on top of that, it was taken almost verbatim from the promotions that were associated with Joseph Merrick, the Elephant Man, who supposedly was a victim of maternal impressions as well. Although it's easy to laugh at these old maternal impression things, keep in mind it wasn't just till a few years ago that everyone was playing classical music to the baby in the womb, thinking it would make him more intelligent. We have now come to the end of our journey, and we started with hypertrichosis, and we're going to end with it. This is my favorite person of the whole talk right here. This is the story of Su Kong Daijin. Daijin was born in China in 1849, and he was afflicted with hypertrichosis. He was born into a highly superstitious family, and they saw his affliction as a work of demons, so his family left him out in the forest to die. A Shaolin monk was traveling through the forest and discovered the abandoned child and took him back to the Fujian Shaolin temple, where Daijun was raised by the monks. He was trained in the martial arts, and it quickly became apparent that he was exceptional in both appearance and in ability. I couldn't imagine facing off against a guy like this, looking at you through all that hair, knowing what he was capable of. But he quickly became a favorite of many of the Shaolin masters, and as a result, each master passed their knowledge on to Daijin, and he became known as the Hairy Master. So he was a sponge and just mastered all the techniques that were shown to him. It said he mastered 200 different styles of empty hand systems and 140 weapon systems. And one of his specialties included the infamous Chai Ma, or the Death Touch. And after several years of training, many years of training, he became the Grand Master of the Shaolin Do and one of the first to master all 7 of the Shaolin temples. There are a lot of legends, understandably, around him. It was said he would get bored beating up the other monks, so he would retreat to the forest to fight bears. And he also led the Shaolin warriors on missions to protect the general populace of southern China from Japanese pirate raids. One of the confirmed historical acts he did was whenever the Chinese emperor came to arrest the Shaolins or had his army march upon the temple, he had the temple burned, and they evacuated and lived to fight another day. And in 1928, after a long career of demonstrating kung fu skill and teaching other students, Master Daijin passed away. It's interesting how Eastern cultures and Western cultures treated children and people with hypertrichosis. Whereas if you remember the Minnesota Woolly Girl, people were trying to steal her and kidnap her all the time. And then here in the Eastern cultures, well, in this case at least, it seems like people would fear hypertrichosis and leave the kids out to die. Thank you for listening today, and I hope I brought to life some of these colorful people for you today. And I hope next time you see some of your genodermatosis patients, you might remember a few of these individuals and remember the obstacles they face, and not feel too sorry for them sometimes, because some of these people ended up doing quite remarkable things despite their disabilities. Also, I put my email address here. If anybody has any thoughts or gripes or concerns or has any further questions, please let me know.